Released in Japan on September 17, 1996, Yugioh would be the newest manga added to the lineup of series published in Weekly Shonen Jump. Written by Kazuki Takahashi, the series follows high schooler Yugi Moto, who solved an ancient puzzle box containing the spirit of a long-dead pharaoh, who uses Yugi's body and its dark magic to exact revenge on those who do harm to his new host. Through the means of shadow games, sadistic punishment games meant to inflict some ironic punishment to its victim. These games varied from chapter to chapter, from stabbing money laid on your hand to griddle ice hockey with a vial of explosive liquid in the middle. Yeah, the original was a bit sadistic. Duel monsters, originally known as Magic and Wizards, appeared in Chapter 9 of the manga, being clearly a nod towards tabletop collectible card games of the era, more specifically Magic the Gathering, which had released 3 years prior. It was meant to be a one-and-done game, similar to the others in the series up to this point, but after numerous fan requests to revisit the game, the series would bring it back a few different times, until eventually the Game of the Week style the series had been written with since its inception was retired entirely for a pivot to the entirely duel monster-focused story with the start of the Duelist Kingdom arc. There would be an anime adaptation of the original run, spanning 27 episodes produced by Toei Animation in 1998, but beyond this, much of the original run would be forgotten once the pivot to Duel Monsters occurred, with the English version of the series completely rebranding into Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist from this point forward. Since the pivot, there had been a demand for physical cards to play the beloved game from the series for quite some time, with Japan receiving their first physical cards for a Konami version of the game in '99 with the release of Volume 1. This would be the official starting point for Yu-Gi-Oh! As a card game, as Volume 1 would lay the groundwork for what would become known as the OCG in Japan, or Official Card Game, which remains the primary version of the game still played in Japan today. Shortly thereafter, a second anime adaptation for Yu-Gi-Oh! Would begin airing in 2000, beginning at the Duelist Kingdom arc and primarily focused on the card game, which would be adapted for an American audience by 4Kids Entertainment starting in September of 2001, sparking a near instant pop culture craze in the America thanks in part to airing back-to-back alongside the already insanely popular Pokemon. This near instant popularity would cause a demand for the same cards in the West, which with the localization team of Upper Deck Entertainment's efforts would begin releasing in America in 2002 as the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading Card Game, or TCG for short. Thus would begin the over 20-year history of the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, the highs, the lows, the humble beginnings to the lightning-paced modern eras. And in order to discuss it, like all things, we must start at the very beginning. Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. Release date, March 8th, 2002. Set type, core set. Major strategies, the baseline. Impact, the start of a long journey. The Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon would be the inaugural set and bring the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG to the masses, being distributed in North America by Upper Deck Entertainment, separately from Konami, the company that owns and distributes Yu-Gi-Oh! In Japan. The basic structure of the game is to use monsters, magic cards, and trap cards to control a board and drop the opponent's life points to 0, winning the game when you did. And as such, this introduction to the game contained mostly vanillas and weak stat lines that are objectively worse than the best ones. Honestly, at this early stage of the game, it was a safe assumption that a monster's stats were the most important part of the card, which led to most decks' primary beater being Skull Redbird at 1550, the strongest attack without a tribute. If we look into monsters that require tributing over existing monsters on the field to summon, the level 5 and 6 1 tribute monsters would get you up to 2k with Curse of Dragon, and the level 7 and higher 2 tribute monsters would receive the highest value in the game of 3000, held by the titular Blue Eyes. As such, since it was extremely difficult to get above a 2k stat line in these early days, some of the most important cards would be those of the 2k defender walls. Aquamador, Mystical Elf, Giant Soldier of Stone, and Spirit of the Harp all held defense values of 2000, meaning that to attack over them it would require a minimum of a 2 tribute monster, locking in Stall as the name of the game. This was further pushed by the only real effect monsters in this pack being those of Maneater Bug and Hane Hane, both of which can answer one monster on a flip effect, meaning triggering them when they are flipped face up, by either destroying it or bouncing it to hand respectively, being defensive options above all else. With Stall being such a popular option, life point dropping was not the only win condition that would be experimented with, as in this early stage there were 3 ways to win: dropping the opponent's life points to 0, which by far was the most common, via deck out by the opponent being unable to draw when they were required, and by far the most memorable, assembling the 5 pieces of Yugioh. Yugioh, if you have it in hand along with the other pieces, wins you the game instantly, meaning that assembling the pieces was a rather popular option out the gate with the defensive prowess of the 2K walls, as well as its popularity in the anime. Thankfully, monsters weren't the only way through, and with that, LOB did bring a number of various magic cards to the game, options to back up your monsters with to provide powerful buffs, debuffs, and general utility to the game state. Some were simple, like the field magics and equip magics that modulated attack and defense values in a minor way, usually capping out at 300 per effect, with field magics modulating the whole board, only allowing one to be up at a time for both players, and equip magics modulating a single monster, staying on the field while that monster is. Some were a lot more complicated, like polymerization, which allowed you to take 2 specific monsters from hand or field and fuse them together to make a new fusion monster kept in the fusion deck. But only one of these even had a respectable enough stat line to even consider, and on top of that, its materials, while including the best 1 tribute monster, didn't do much in terms of a 2K wall meta, meaning that you'd only be really playing them in case you drew all 3 at once, which wasn't the most reliable strategy, especially when it could be removed by any number of the removal magic cards at this stage, including Fissure, which pops the lowest attack monster the opponent controls, Dark Hole, which wipes the board of all monsters, and Raigeki, which just wipes the opponent's monsters. Because of the over-reliance on walls at this initial stage, these 3 cards were some of the most powerful cards you could be playing, alongside the utility magic cards of Monster Reborn, which let you bring back any monster from either graveyard, and Pot of Greed, which
this card allows me to draw 2 new cards.
There was also Swords of Revealing Light, which effectively stalled out the game for 3 turns by blocking the opponent's attack, once again useful for stall strategies. There were also trap cards, which operate like magic cards except they can be activated whenever you want as long as they have been face down for a turn. However, this initial set only gave us 3. Dragon Capture Jar was by far and away the worst of the 3, being a continuous trap, meaning it stays on the field after you activate it, swapping all dragons to defense while face up. This really only ever countered specifically Blue Eyes White Dragon, and as such never really saw use since any of the removal magics could take care of him just fine on their own. Two-pronged attack was a bit more useful, able to destroy any opponent's monster by destroying 2 of your own, being a versatile removal option that can be used on your opponent's turn, but also came with the heavy cost of removing your own board presence, making its utility limited overall. The one trap that would be unanimously determined as actually worthwhile was Trap Hole, able to destroy anything that is normal summoned or flip summoned with 1,000 attack or more. Seeing as how special summons effectively only happened via polymerization or Monster Reborn, this meant that 90% of the time you could stop an opponent's power push right as it's getting started, being another option loaded into the arsenal of the removal tools in this initial landscape. Overall, this was a bit of a bleak looking game right out the gate, as anyone who's played even a single game of LOB format can attest, but thankfully this initial stage only lasted a couple of weeks, as a few other releases would help spark a more common interest in the game as a whole over the remainder of the month. The first would be the localization of 2 video games for the franchise, being Dark Duel Stories for the Game Boy Color and Forbidden Memories for the PlayStation. Both of these games do not follow the actual rules of the TCG, utilizing their own unique sets of rules that make them quite interesting games to play through, which I've actually covered before on this channel, but they also each came with 3 promo cards for the newly released TCG to help spark an interest, with Forbidden Memories coming with Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon, Harpy's Pet Dragon, and Metal Morph, and Dark Duel Stories having promo versions of Blue Eyes, Dark Magician, and Yugioh. While none of these were relevant, Forbidden Memories promos specifically would set the precedent that new releases could come from these promos exclusively, with this being the only way for obtaining these cards until 2007 for Black Metal and Metal Morph, and until 2009 for Harpy's Pet Dragon, marking themselves in the coming years as collector's pieces, with the Dark Duel Stories promos specifically being some of the most sought after cards from these early months to this day. The other release, and by far the more impactful to the game as a whole, was the release of the Yugi and Kaiba starter decks, which not only made the game far more accessible for kids in 2002, but also included the official instructions on how to play the game, something the initial booster packs had no way of conveying. You would think that these starters would be just collections of cards from the initial set, packaged as a basic deck to get players started out, but you'd be mistaken, as these decks not only contained entirely new cards, but also a slew of cards that blew the meta of LOB wide open. version. For starters, there were a number of new no tribute monsters that all put Skull Redbird to shame, including Great White, Rogue Doll, Ryukishin Powered and Man-Eating Treasure Chest at 1600, Neo the Magic Swordsman and Battleox at 1700, and the end-all be-all of all beaters in these early days, Lajin the Mystical Genie of the Lamp at 1800. These would completely warp the beatdown meta around themselves, being a slew of monsters with respectable stat lines, but that wasn't the best part. Summon Skull would also be released here, a 1 tribute 2500 attack monster, now being the most powerful 1 tribute that could actually attack over the 2k walls that plagued the game up to this point. The sudden rise of Summon Skull would also make Trap Hole infinitely more important, as it was one of the only ways to prevent a massive advantage swing to your opponent off of summoning a single monster. Walls also got a significant buff too with Wall of Illusion, which sacrifices 150 defense from the 2k baseline in order to bounce anything that attacks it back to hand. This trade-off was a no-brainer at this stage, as even with the new attackers in the pool, 1850 was still high enough to block any no tribute attacker, and attacking over it with a 1 tribute attack would put that threat back in the hand, rendering any board presence it made moot. There was also now Trap Master, who on flip could pop a set trap card, which in turn made it quite useful for setting as a bluff, with many assuming it was a wall of some kind, then flipping it the next turn to potentially remove a problem trap before developing your attacker. There were also new traps here to buff out the super type, being those of Waboku, able to block all damage and battle destruction for a turn, Reinforcements, able to buff a monster's attack by 500 for a turn, and Ultimate Offering, which gives you an extra summons during your main phase or the opponent's battle phase at the cost of 500 life points per summon. These all found immediate use, with Reinforcements giving Beatdown away over the walls, Waboku letting Stall keep their walls up or letting Beatdown take crash trades, and Ultimate Offering being one of the most reliable ways to swarm a board at this stage. As for new magic cards, Change of Heart would be another addition to this power magic lineup, able to steal an opponent's monster for a turn, marking itself as a massive advantage swinger, especially if you're able to steal a monster to then tribute over for your own summoned Skull. Card Destruction also helped fill the necessary void, making both players discard their hands to draw the same number of cards, being a counter card for specifically the instant win condition of Exodia, but also for being a massive draw tool. Lastly would be the surfacing of the first true game plan deck, being that of Dragon Turbo. Lord of D blocks targeting dragon monsters with card effects, but much more importantly, while on the field, enables the magic card the Flute of Summoning Dragon, which special summons 2 dragons from the hand. This combo could realistically summon out 2 tribute dragons with ease, meaning accessing multiple copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon at once was now theoretically possible, though not super reliable as it did require a bunch of factors to roll in your favor. Still, it would be a disservice to not mention it. This would be the metagame for the next month, being a tug of war between beatdown and stall decks, with the numerous power magics effectively determining which way the game would go constantly. As such, Upper Deck would implement a Forbidden and Limited list to the TCG on May 7th of 2002, which notably did contain a Forbidden section already, though did not place any cards into it. As for limitations, newly limited, meaning only 1 copy of each is allowed in your deck, were the 5 pieces of Exodia, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki, and newly semi-limited, meaning up to 2 copies each are allowed per deck, were Card Destruction and Swords of Revealing Light. This was a bit of cleanup to the massive power magic card nature of the meta at large, limiting the Exodia pieces to prevent issues with draw magics causing an FTK, or first turn kill, as well as what had become known in the metagame as the Power 5 magic cards. Each of these cards was known to be able to completely swing the course of a game on their own, with Change of Heart stealing a monster to push massive advantage swings, Dark Hole and Raigeki's board wipes being known by all, Monster Reborn's Revival being uncounterable at the time, and Pot of Greed getting you to copies of the other 4 more reliably. With this limitation, the first true historic format of the game was forged, being referred to as Yugi Kaiba format, named for the starter decks of the era, and it is commonly referenced as the first true format of the game's history, which saw basically named strategies like Beatdown and Stall becoming common faces, with a couple of game plan decks like Dragon Turbo in the fringes. This balance update would also set a precedent, being that roughly a month to 2 months after each core set release, an update to the Forbidden and Limited list would be released to help balance out any power outliers from the previous set and keep the meta as a whole healthier, adjusting where needed. This metagame would be fairly solved for just under the next 2 months, only shaken up by the release of the next core set to the game, which, considering it was about to double the available card pool, was bound to change something. Metal Raiders. Release date, June 26, 2002. Set type, core set. Major strategies, new effects to spice up the game. Impact, the rise of the critter. Metal Raiders was the second set released for the TCG, and rather than taking the same direction as LOB by introducing a bunch of stat sticks with not much else, Raiders took a completely different approach by introducing a variety of monsters with effects to cover a variety of use cases. Notably, almost all of the effect monsters in this set come in either pairs or sets of 6, with each set having similar effects to one another for different scenarios. Magician of Faith and Mask of Darkness are new flip monsters, recovering back a resource from grave on flip, with Faith grabbing back a magic and Mask grabbing back a trap. These would be experimented with almost immediately, with Mask able to recover key traps like Trap Hole and a few cards released in this set, and Faith able to recover any of the Power 5. As such, with the Power 5 being limited now and being completely game warping, Magician of Faith would move from this initial experimentation to being a staple piece of the meta as a whole, being a recycler that takes a turn to fire, which in this slow-paced metagame was perfectly acceptable for a drawback. Mystic Lamp, Legul, Oguchi, Genzo No. 7, Rainbow Flower, and Queen's Double all share the same effect to be able to attack the opponent's life points directly, being effectively chip shots that didn't do much overall, but did establish the effect for cards in the future. Hoshinigin, Starboy, Milus Radiant, Little Chimera, Bladefly, and Witch's Apprentice all share the effect to boost their respective attributes attack by 500 and decrease their designated rival attribute by 400 attack, with the rival pairings being Light and Dark, Water and Fire, and Earth and Wind. Once again, these weren't too meta impactful for the time being, but would be important in establishing a baseline for attribute support as a whole, which would get expanded upon in the next core set. White Magical Hat and Masked Sorcerer make advantage pushes upon dealing battle damage, with Hat discarding a card from the opponent's hand and Masked Sorcerer drawing a card. While neither of these would be particularly popular in historic play, retro play has discovered that Masked Sorcerer was actually a lot more useful than people initially expected, as by taking advantage on the board followed by its summon, you could standardly push far more advantage than the opponent was ready for by threatening draws. On top of that, its 1400 defense was able to stop most of the effect monsters that we're going to be discussing here, meaning that you would need to use one of the normal monsters as a stat stick, or some kind of a removal spell to get over it. And because you're attacking it face down, there's no way you're going to know that going into it. Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, each upon being sent to grave, searches a monster from deck, with Sangan searching one with 1500 or less attack, and Witch searching for one with 1500 or less defense. These two were, without hyperbole, the best monsters in the set. Sangan and Witch could effectively search most monsters in the game at this stage, with them also being able to search each other if the desired monster was not in their individual search pool, being in the other. As such, beatdown focused decks heavily preferred Witch, able to grab key pieces like Lejin and Summon Skull, while stall focused decks preferred Sangan, able to grab any of the 2k walls or Wall of Illusion. These two would be a staple piece of every deck for the time being though, seeing play at their maximum allowed copies for a while after release. Crass and Dream Clown have board controlling effects tied to the changing of the battle position of the clown, with Crass bouncing a monster when swapping from defense to attack, and Dream popping a monster when swapping from attack to defense. These would be experimented with in an early days deck called Clown Control, aimed at utilizing the limited number of battle position changing cards to quickly swap the clowns between positions. But this would be mostly ineffective due to the lack of viable position swapping tools. Jirai Gumo and Dark Elf would take the mantle of the strongest no tribute summons at 2200 and 2000 attack respectively, but both coming with drawbacks to use that power, with Jirai taking a coin flip to see if you lose half of your life points when you attack, and Dark Elf taking a static 1000 payment to attack. While Jirai's cost was a bit too high to see real usage, Dark Elf on the other hand would see some considerable play, being effectively another 2k wall that could use that stat to attack with, as long as you're willing to pay the 1000 cost. Moving away from the pairs, there were also plenty of powerful standalone cards. 7-colored Fish would join Lejin at 1800 attack, being the most powerful no tribute summon that didn't come with any form of a drawback. Tribute to the Doomed provided targeted removal for monsters at a cost of a discard, being more directable than Fissure for a heavier cost. Thunder Dragon can discard itself to search for up to 2 additional copies from deck, being one of the most powerful deck thinning options at this stage, but also enabling Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon, being a powerful fusion that was actually decently easy to access thanks to one material being able to turn itself into 2. Cannon Soldier was able to tribute any other monster to burn the opponent for 500 any number of times a turn, which could be utilized with a combination of Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest, and Ultimate Offering to burn the opponent for 3k or more, but took an equal amount of life to pull off, so could only close a game from ahead. Muka Muka, while starting at a lower attack value of 600, gains 300 attack for every card in your hand, which going into the opponent's turn after discarding for hand size meant it could be sitting at 2400 with a full hand of 6. bricks, making it the most powerful no tribute attack value at this stage, but with heavy asterisks around that value. Heavy Storm serves as a counterpart to Dark Hole, able to wipe all magic and traps off the board in an instant, which both led to less bluff setting as a whole, but also a whole new level of bluff setting by setting Heavy Storm, making your opponent think that you didn't have it to set the fort, and then flipping it to wipe their board of options. Speaking of those options, Mirror Force was a new trap that, on the opponent's attack declaration, destroyed all of their attack position monsters. This was by far and away one of the most powerful options in the set, being effectively a pseudo Raigeki that could be used on the opponent's turn, moving it to see play in everything. Lastly would be the introduction of a new card type in counter traps, being unique as these were the only cards considered what is to be referred to as spell speed 3, meaning that once you chain a counter trap, the only thing that can be chained to it is another counter trap. All of these counter traps had a negation effect for a cost, with Magic Jammer negating magics with a discard, 7 Tools of the Bandit negating a trap for 1000 life points, Horn of Heaven negating a summon with a monster tribute, and Solemn Judgment doing all 3 for half of your life points. Out of these options, 7 Tools and Horn of Heaven were considerably weaker than the other two. Solemn Judgment was unquestionably the best of these cards, but with the cost of half of your life points and the community at large not making the connection that the only important life point is the last one at this stage, it wouldn't see immediate widespread usage, but would be referred to as one of the strongest traps of the set. Magic Jammer though would see considerable play as Magic cards were unquestionably the most powerful cards in the game at this stage, and negating any of the power 5 with a Magic Jammer could spell fatal for the match as a whole. Similarly to LOB, a limited list would go into effect a week later to balance out the set, moving Mirror Force to limited and Sangan, Witch, and Heavy Storm to semi-limited. These changes came down so quickly because of the OCG, being the Japanese version of the game, which had these changes in place before the TCG set even released, allowing for, in most cases, the TCG to adopt the OCG changes rather quickly after a set's release. Now with Metal Raiders' release, though 7 colored fish got added to match Legend's 1800 attack value, they were still both considered the cornerstone of the meta, being 1800 attack as the strongest no drawback value you could have without getting into tribute summons, and thankfully both of these were easy to come by, with Legend being in a starter deck and Fish being a common in Metal Raiders. Add to that the price of the game as a whole being decent as the more expensive options were a bit few and far between, with really the only standouts at this stage being those of Raigeki, Mirror Force, and Heavy Storm, with most if not all of the other power cards being available at lower rarity printed in either their respective sets or in a starter deck. That was about to change with the release of the first tournament pack. Tournament Pack First Season, or TP1 for short, was a promotional pack given for entry for the first season of sanctioned events at the local level. These were some of the roughest packs in the history of the game to open, as the pull rates for specific cards were abysmal. This set came with 15 commons, 10 rares, 4 super rares, and 1 ultra rare in the set list, and not even a rare was guaranteed out of these packs, with the rare pull rates being roughly 1 in every 3 packs. Supers were even lower at 1 in 18, and ultras were the worst, seeing only 1 in every 108 packs. What made matters worse on this is that you couldn't buy these packs, as you could only ever get them from entering sanctioned events at the time, and would only receive 1 by doing so, which made hunting for a full set a chore and a half, and that was made worse by what the high end of the set actually was. All of these cards were random OCG imports, 97% of which were just not useful in the meta at all, such as Patrol Robo, who could look at a face down card, just one face down card, as much as you'd like, or Axe Raider, whose attack value was already less than that of Lejeune and Fish before it, and those were the super rares. However, the ultra rare slot here was occupied by Mechanical Chaser, an 1850 attack monster, now being the highest attack no drawback option, and that was a massive deal. To say that Mechanical Chaser changed the dynamic of the meta instantly on release is an understatement. 1850 is more than 1800, and as such, Mechanical Chaser would instantly be a staple to any deck for players that could afford its $200 price tag, being so high due to the abysmally small pull rate of TP1. And mind you, that's $200 in 2002. This was a massive departure from the solidly affordable pieces up until this point. Mechanical Chaser being exclusive to the tournament pack, in addition to being a roughly 1 in 108 packs pull rate, which equates to roughly 1 in every 5.5 boxes of the 20 pack set, and the only way to get them was to participate in an official tournament, where you would only get 1 pack, marking the beginning of a massive price disparity between players across the game's reach. There would be another core set release in the same month too, and that price disparity was about to get a bit worse, as the Power 5 were about to get a run for their money for the title of the best magics in the game. Spell Grueler. Release date, September 16th, 2002. Set type, core set. Major strategies, tune, equip spells, rituals, impact, new power, spell, in town. I was gonna save this topic until we got to its time relevant point, but I think now is probably the best point to discuss it due to the repercussions it had on this set in particular. Magic Ruler was the third set in the TCG, but if you've bought any of the reprintings of the set since the initial waves in the early aughts, you probably know it by the name Spell Ruler. In 2003, over a year after the game's initial release, Upper Deck made the decision to rebrand all of the Magic cards that we've seen over the game thus far into Spell cards, and by extension rename this set to Spell Ruler specifically to avoid copyright issues with Wizards of the Coast and their game Magic the Gathering, and because of this, we'll now be referring to all Magic cards as spell cards from here on out. Spell Ruler, being the third set, followed a bit of a theme established with Metal Raiders, where Metal Raiders arguably overhauled the monster super type, giving effect monsters with interesting interactions to the game as a whole compared to LOB. Spell Ruler, as the name implies, gives an overhaul to spells, namely in a full establishment of the spell subcategories. At this stage, we already had normal, field, and equip spells, but with Spell Ruler we would receive the other three subcategories of quick play, ritual, and continuous in addition to an overhaul of the previous categories. So let's take this one at a time. Equip spells saw a departure from the exclusivity of their previous incarnation to not only being extremely generic, but also providing far more significant effects and provide an additional effect when sent from field to grave, generally to recycle it. Some of these were minor, such as Horn of Light's 800 defense boost and 500 life to recycle to the top of deck optionally, Black Pendant's 500 attack boost and 500 burn when sent to grave, Malevolent Nuzzler's 700 attack boost and 500 life to recycle to top of deck optionally, or Horn of the Unicorn's 700 attack and defense boost with a required recycle to top of deck. But there were two in particular that were extremely powerful. Axe of Despair boosted its equip by 1000 attack, being the largest modifier in the game currently, and could recycle by tributing a monster when sent to grave, though generally never would use that effect due to the heavy cost, seeing play namely for the attack boost. The other being Megamorph, which doubles the attack of its equip if your life points are lower than the opponent's, or halves it if your life points are higher, being an extremely powerful tool for either making a massive comeback push or pushing advantage while you are ahead by equipping it to an opponent's monster. All of this was helped by the monster Mahavilo, who gains an additional 500 attack for every equip spell on them, meaning that prior to any boost a single equip provided, they would already be sitting at 2050, a significant number able to swing over almost any no tribute monster in the game, even the 2k walls, leading to an equip aggro deck being an extremely popular option in the new meta. There was also another equip spell meant to be used exclusively on the opponent's monsters, being Snatch Steal, effectively a change of heart as long as it's equipped, giving the opponent 1000 life for each of their turns you control it. This would be the first of 5 spells seen as the power spells of the set, being effectively additional copies of Change of Heart for most decks in the game, as the drawback wasn't nearly significant enough to discourage playing. Field spells would probably get the least significant boost to the existing types, being 6 field spells tied to monster attributes, being Gaia Power for Earth, Umeruka for water, Molten Destruction for fire, Rising Air Current for wind, Luminous Spark for light, and Mystic Plasma Zone for dark, with each boosting their attributes attack by 500 and dropping its attributes defense by 400. In the same vein of attribute support, each would also get what would become colloquially referred to as the element recruiters, being monsters that, when destroyed in battle, summon another monster of their attribute with 1500 or less attack from deck. These were Giant Rat for earth, Mother Grizzly for water, UFO Turtle for fire, Flying Kamakiri No. 1 for wind, Shining Angel for light, and Mystic Tomato for dark. Of these, the only one that would make an instant impact was Mystic Tomato, namely in that it could summon either Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest, giving you access then to that stat pool for the entire deck, which is extra impactful because of Sangan and Witch's semi-limits. Moving into the new subcategories, quick play spells operate as a pseudo-hybrid between spells and traps. During your turn, you can activate them from hand whenever they'd be appropriate at the same spell speed as a trap, meaning that you can fire them in battle or in phase while they're in your hand, or if you set them, they effectively become trap cards, being prevented from activating for the rest of the turn, but being usable on either player's turn at the same spell speed as a trap. For this set though, there was only 2 quick play spells that would be relevant, being Mystical Space Typhoon, a targeted spell trap removal piece, and Rush Recklessly, which power crept reinforcements by not only giving more attack at 700, but also being usable from hand on your own turn without setting it. These would both be important pieces for the developing metagame, with MST becoming almost a staple piece for years to come after this release, being the de facto spell trap removal piece for the next few eras. Ritual spells were tied to the new monster category of rituals, which operated in a similar vein to fusions. While fusions took a specific spell and 2+ specific monsters in hand for a boss that was always available, rituals take a specific boss card and a specific spell in hand with the materials to make it being generic, taking tributes whose total levels are equal or greater than the monster being ritual summoned. There were a few rituals released here, most of which were unimpactful pack filler at best, but there was one true exception to this. Relinquished was a level 1 ritual, meaning it could be summoned the easiest out of all of them using only one monster as a tribute, and could steal an opponent's monster to be an equip onto himself, gaining that monster's attack and defense as well as battle protection by popping the equip instead. While not meta defining by any means, this was experimented with quite frequently, especially thanks to cards like Senju of the Thousand Hands and Sonic Bird, which could grab one of the 2 required cards each and could double as the tribute if necessary. The last of these new subcategories of spell would be Continuous, operating in the exact same vein as Continuous Traps, staying on the field after activation. Most of these new continuous spells fall into the category of what I refer to as the taxes cards, being continuous spells that require both players to pay a cost in order to take an action, such as Toll requiring a 500 life point payment to attack, Chain Energy requiring a 500 life point payment to play any card out of the hand, and Gravekeeper Servant requiring the opponent to mill a card to attack. In a similar vein, Messenger of Peace blocked either player from attacking with monsters with 1500 or more attack, but had an upkeep cost, requiring the controller to pay 100 life points in each of their standby phases or lose the card, which was an insultingly low cost if we're being fair. Lastly, Toon World simply requires a 1000 life point payment to activate with no other effects. This might seem useless, but in fact was meant as a way to enable the new subtype of monsters known as Toons, which at this point in time must first special summon themselves from hand if you control Toon World at the same tribute cost as if you were normal summoning them. Can't attack the turn they hit the board, must pay 500 to attack, can attack directly, and are destroyed if Toon World is not on the field. This initial batch included Blue Eyes Toon Dragon, Manga Rioran, Toon Mermaid, and Toon Summon Skull, all being monsters used by Pegasus in the original anime. Toon as a strategy had a lot of ifs behind it. They were good if you saw Toon World, and if you could set up on the big attackers fast, and if your monsters survived the turn, and if the opponent had no removal for your Toon World in the same set that MST gets released. There were just too many ifs to get around the idea that any number of cards removed these from the board, and the investment of both time and life points just wasn't worth it at this stage. Moving away from the spell super types, there were also a number of new regular spells added here that would push the needle that much further. Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and the Forceful Sentry were all spells that hand-ripped the opponent in slightly different ways, with Confiscation taking 1000 life point payment to look at the opponent's hand and discard one, Delinquent Duo taking 1000 to discard one at random and have the opponent discard another of their choice, and Forceful Sentry for no cost looking at the opponent's hand to send one card in it back to the deck. All 3 of these were invaluably powerful, with Confiscation and Forceful having the additional benefit of hand knowledge and the choice of what card to rip, while Delinquent trades that to take 2 cards instead. In the short period of these cards released until the balancing ban list that follows these sets, the format would be completely terrorized by hand rip aggro decks, maxing out on 3 copies of each of these, causing a truly unfun playing experience. Upstart Goblin, by giving the opponent 1000 life, draws a card, being effectively a free deck thinning piece that replaces itself, though wasn't popular at this stage due to players placing a lot heavier emphasis on life totals. Giant Trunade effectively operates as a 1-turn reprieve from back row, bouncing all spell traps back to their owner's hand. For now, this was effectively Heavy Storm light, but would see far more interesting applications as time moves forward. Painful Choice lets you choose 5 cards from the deck, has the opponent pick 1 to add to your hand, and sends the others to grave. This is a bit of a Sophie's Choice in many respects, allowing you to show your opponent the 5 best cards left in your deck and give you 1. But given the power level of the format, it wasn't too overbearing at this stage, though clearly would get a lot better with time. Giant Germ and Nimble Momonga are 2 additional floaters that operate uniquely compared to the attribute ones, floating into 2 additional copies of themselves, with Germ burning for 500 and Momonga healing for 1000 when destroyed in battle. These would see some more minor experimentation, though the preference at the time was placed onto Momonga due to the heavier life point swing, but they didn't last for too long past the initial testing period. Lastly, Cyberjar, on flip, nukes all monsters on the field, has both players draw 5 and reveal them, and summons all level 4 or lowers among those cards in either attack or face down defense. This was a massive blowout card, effectively resetting the board and potentially causing a massive swing of board advantage if not handled correctly, which made this an almost instant staple for various decks, especially going into a hand rip heavy metagame. Thankfully, that completely unrestricted Wild West of hand rips would only last about 2 weeks, as the ban list was updated just 2 weeks later on October 1st, placing limits on Cyberjar, Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, Painful Choice, Snatch Steal, the Forceful Sentry, and Upstart Goblin, all of which were identified as the big advantage pushers of the set, but at 1 each, they would still be an active part of the metagame as a whole. They also wouldn't be the only hand rippers joining, as on the same day, distribution for Tournament Pack 2 would begin, sporting the new extremely expensive and difficult to find card in Morphing Jar, who on flip discards both players' hands and has both draw 5. This would pose a shift in the player mindset, as previously players adapted to not set their back row too heavily to play around Heavy Storm. Now, players would look at setting their entire hand to play around Morphing Jar, creating a unique mind game to what option the opponent might be sporting at any time cards get set. While this option was not as clearly meta warping as a mechanical chaser before it, it was still a uniquely powerful effect that would affect the metagame at large, even if it wasn't a staple in majority of decks. Another new change would come just 3 days later in the first ever collectible tins, offering reprints of some of the more iconic cards from these initial packs alongside boosters for the first 3 sets, with the tin covers of Dark Magician, Blue Eyes, Red Eyes, Summon Skull, Lord of D, and Black Skull Dragon. On top of that, the Eternal Duelist Soul would release for the Game Boy Advance 2 weeks later, bringing another set of unique promos in Exchange, Graceful Dice, and Skull Dice. Though none of these would be particularly meta impactful, but did continue the trend of providing unique cards as video game tie-in promos. This would also be the precursor to the 4th set for the TCG, which with Metal Raiders overhauling monsters and Spell Rulers overhauling spells, I'm sure you can guess where this set is going. Pharaoh's Servant. Release date, October 20th, 2002. Set type, core set. Major strategies, trap counterparts to spells, counters to various gameplay elements. Impact, the early signs of power creep. Pharaoh's Servant was the 4th set for the TCG, and quite notably came out only a month after Spell Ruler, being so far the fastest turnaround time for a core set in the TCG, with the standard up until this point being a 3-month gap, supposedly being so that there could be 4 core sets in a year, giving the set a beat before the holiday shopping season started, and to help catch up to the OCG set release schedule, which releases on average 4 sets a year, but notably the TCG sets at this point are combining together 2 OCG sets at a time, which at 4 TCG sets a year would be equivalent to 8 OCG sets. Pharaoh's Servant on paper seemed to be trying to overhaul traps in the same vein as the previous 2 sets overhauled monsters and spells, but in reality only a few of these traps would be impactful in the slightest, though the ones that broke through would truly shine as power players for the game as a whole. Call of the Haunted effectively read as Monster Reborn on a trap, with the additional downside of tying the monster to the trap where if it gets destroyed the monster dies too. This was arguably worse than Monster Reborn, only hitting your own grave and having the destruction drawback, but was also chainable to cards or flippable in response to attacks, making it have many applications that Reborn simply didn't. One such application was in the case of MST, as you could chain it to an MST targeting it while it's set to revive a Sanganer Witch, having the MST pop it right after and getting a search off since the monster was destroyed in the process. In the same vein as Call, Premature Burial is an equipped spell that can revive a monster for 800 life points, also tying the monster to the destruction of the spell. While in many respects this was a direct downgrade to Reborn, an interesting quirk of the spell was that it specified that the monster was only destroyed if Premat was also destroyed, meaning that if it was removed from the field without destruction, the monster would remain, leading to an option of utilizing Giant Trunade from the last set to not only clear back row temporarily, but also to reuse Premature without losing the initial monster. Imperial Order would be the other standout card, negating all spells while active at the cost of a 700 life point payment in your standby phase. Quite notably for the time, this was an optional upkeep cost, meaning that you could flip it on the opponent's turn, negating their spells for the whole turn, then not pay it coming into your turn to destroy it and use your own power spell, being an instant staple with the insane amount of power it held. Almost out of necessity, since Imperial Order would negate its primary counter in MST, Dust Tornado would also be printed here, being a trap card MST that also had the option to set another spell trap from hand on resolution, being niche, but giving the card some applications that MST just doesn't. Time Seal skips the opponent's next draw phase, effectively making them miss a draw as a slow hand rip of sorts. This wouldn't be particularly useful yet, being effectively a 1 to 3 turn delay on getting its effect, but as more hand rip options become available, this would find a home. Backup Soldier, if you have 5 or more monsters in grave, returns 3 1500 or less attack normals from grave to hand, being next to useless for a majority of decks, but for Exodia specifically allows them the painful choice away 3 pieces and recover them with a 2-card combo. Ceasefire flips all monsters face up and burns the opponent for 500 for each effect monster on the field, notably blocking all flip effects when doing so. This would be seen as a way to counter out the various flip effects like Magician of Faith, Cyberjar, and Morphing Jar that had gotten popular as options for the metagame, but not nearly as usefully as Nobleman of Crossout, which banishes a set monster, then if it was a flip, banishes all copies of that monster from both players' decks. Knock would quickly become a staple of the metagame, not only for countering out flips, but for removing defensive options before they become a thorn. Moving past the spells and traps, Jinzo is a 1 tribute 2400 attack monster that, as long as he's on the field, negates all traps. While tribute summonable monsters have been mostly unimpactful since Summon Skull, Jinzo trades 100 200 attack points to completely remove threats like Trap Hole and Mirror Force from the equation, marking himself as a solid addition to many various strategies. Morphing Jar number 2, on flip, shuffles all monsters on the field back into the deck, has players reveal cards off the top until they reveal the same number of monsters they shuffled back, summons all level 4 or lower ones face down in defense, and sends all other cards to the grave. A similar effect to Cyber Jar in many respects, Morphing Jar number 2 would see play in a similar vein, though not nearly as widespread as the aforementioned Jar. Cold Wave stuns the usage of all spells and traps for a turn, usable only as the first action of your main phase 1. At this point in time, this would see next to no play, as both Heavy Storm and Giant Trunade did its job better. But as time moves on, this will become far more powerful as the expectation of what monsters alone can do will be raised significantly. Limiter removal doubles the attack of all of your machines for the turn, but then destroys them all at the end of the turn. This would be a major draw to play machine-centric strategies, though powerful enough machines to fill the niche were few and far between, with the only currently viable piece to fill that void being Mechanical Chaser, so that would be considered niche for now. Thousand Eyes Restrict is a fusion of Relinquished and Thousand Eyes Idle that shares the same effect as Relinquished that also prevents attacking and battle position swapping. By far and away the most powerful fusion we've seen yet, though still wasn't good enough to see play through the glaring downsides of playing fusions in the first place, but would be relevant later in the era. Goblin Attack Force has a record-breaking 2300 attack on a no tribute summon, but has the nasty downside of swapping to defense if it attacks for 2 turns, making it a massive double-edged sword in a way, but still a powerful option for beatdown strategies. The Fiend Mega Cyber, if the opponent has 2 or more monsters than you, can be special summoned from hand. This would be the first of its kind come from behind catch-up tool, but the issue stood that if the opponent had massed that much advantage over you on board, there were plenty of other tools available to even that out, like Mirror Force, Raigeki, and Dark Hole, that would all be more useful outside of that specific situation. Lastly, Gearfried the Iron Knight matched its attack stat to Lajin and 7 colored, but had the drawback of not being able to be used with equip spells. While that sounds like a pain, the biggest draw to this was actually that Gearfried couldn't be taken with Snatch Steal, which in a weird way made him actually a safer option to play over the previous 2 1800s. The balancing for this particular set would come a little over a month later, notably making more than just changes reflecting this set, but also adjustments to cards from previous sets. Newly limited were Jinzo, Morphing Jar, Witch of the Black Forest, Card Destruction, Limiter Removal, Premature Burial, Swords of Revealing Light, Call of the Haunted, Ceasefire, and Imperial Order. Newly semi-limited were Morphing Jar number 2, Nobleman of Crossout, and Backup Soldier. While a good number of the cards from this set were expected to be meta breakers, in reality only a small handful were, and that was going to become a trend for a bit in the TCG, having sets that bring in these massive counts of cards only to have maybe 4 or 5 be relevant, perpetuating the issue of the TCG at this stage that it was effectively good card turbo. This would lead us out of 2002 Yu-Gi-Oh! As we entered 2003, with another core set around the corner to potentially disprove that point. Labyrinth of Nightmare. Release date, March 1st, 2003. Set type, core set. Major strategies, Grave Banishers, Destiny Board. Impact, a handful of staples. Labyrinth of Nightmare was the first set of 2003, and as such needed to help carry the TCG forward, and it was safe to say that by this point, we were leaving the establishment sets and were headed in the direction of the game's identity being found. Lawn provided some new tools to the table, building on the ideas of the previous sets to bring them forward. Some ideas were simple ones, such as Gemini Elf now being the largest attack normal summon body at 1900, making Mechanical Chaser not quite as necessary, but in the same vein as attack values, provided tools that could either reach higher for lower downsides, or could naturally hit the benchmarks that have been expected up until this point. Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer would be the benchmark of sorts, being 1800 attack with an effect that was almost purely upsides, able to banish 2 monsters from the opponent's grave when it deals damage, and prevents the opponent from banishing cards from the grave at all. This was namely meant as a counter to the Grave Banisher duo of Bazoo the Soul Eater and Skull Lair, each of which could banish monsters from the grave to gain attack in Bazoo's case, gaining 300 for each up to 3, or popping a monster with a level equal to the number of banished monsters in the case of Lair. A point of note, however, was that these 2 cards were actually mistranslated upon their initial release, not specifying monsters, but instead cards. This would be corrected in later printings of the cards and almost instantly in an errata clarification post to Upper Deck's website, but for the time being made them a bit of a headache for the local tournament scene, as the difference between cards and monsters on these cards moved them from staples and everything to extremely niche inclusions, though Bazoo would still see significant enough play for the ability to reach a respectable stat level with its effect. Zombira the Dark starts at a 2100 stat line on a level 4, but loses 200 attack every time it destroys something in battle and can't attack directly. A budget option for those who couldn't afford a playset of the secret rare Gemini Elf, Zombire of the Dark would see significant play for many players specifically because of its price point, though there were better options available. Equips would easily get the most powerful options yet in United We Stand, which boosts a monster by 800 for every monster you control, and Mage Power, which boosts by 500 for every spell trap you control. United, while the more powerful boost, was the harder of the two to get to high numbers because of the nature of sticking monsters at this stage, though Mage Power could, in the right circumstances, provide a near instant 2500 attack boost to any monster. Both of these would see play, but with the nature of spell trap removal being a common sight for most decks, they would only be minorly impactful long term. Offerings to the Doom provided targeted monster removal at the cost of your next draw phase. Being effectively a quick play version of Tribute that also kicks the cost down the road, Offerings would see play as a removal option, but notably with card advantage becoming increasingly important, wouldn't be as widespread as you might expect. Card of Safe Return, every time a monster is summoned from your grave, draws a card. This, at this point in time, was inconsistent, as the three primary Grave Revival cards were all limited, but was noted as being potentially one of the most broken cards imaginable down the road if we received anything worthwhile with decent Grave recursive summoning. Trap-wise, we saw a few more interesting deviations, such as the first new alternative win condition since Exodia, Destiny Board. In each of the opponent's end phases, you can activate a Spirit Message in the correct order out of hand or deck, winning the game if you get all 5 cards into your spell trap zones. The issue with this was that the entire thing is extremely interruptible, as any spell trap removal piece nukes all of them. They block your spell trap zone so you can't use other options, and to top it all off, it's an extremely slow moving win condition, giving your opponent at least 3 turns to respond to it if you use Destiny Board in their end phase for the surprise factor. Magic Cylinder could negate an attack and deal damage back to the opponent equal to that monster's attack, being a decently solid burn option to tinker with, but being far less desirable compared to Mirror Force, but still seeing play considering the other option is limited. Mask of Restrict prevents tributing as long as it's on the field, being an effective floodgate against tribute decks, but notably the best decks at this stage were playing, at most, 1 tribute summonable monster in Genzo. Lastly and most importantly, Torrential Tribute, in response to a monster summon, nukes all monsters on the field. A dark hole that's activatable like Trap Hole was an insanely powerful tool, bringing another nuke into the back row arsenal of most players almost instantly. Nightmare brought a small handful of really powerful cards into the pool, but sadly, most of the cards within its pack were, to put bluntly, a flop. This seemed to be a growing trend between here and Pharaohs, bringing about 5 to 6 cards that get added into the arsenal of the good card piles, with most if not all of the rest being either tools for more niche strategies or completely discarded outright. This would be followed by 2 new starter decks to complement the start of the year for the TCG, being starter decks Joey and Pegasus, which for the most part reprinted a handful of cards from both Joey and Pegasus's decks from the anime. However, both brought 1 new card each to make the purchase of the decks really sing to veteran players, and sing they would. From Joey, Scapegoat summons 4 0/0 tokens in defense, effectively being able to chump block 4 attacks for free, which would prove to be a solid inclusion for some strategies almost as a multi-turn attack blocker. From Pegasus, Graceful Charity draws 3 cards and discards 2. This was unbelievably powerful out of the box, being a near instant staple in allowing players to see more of their deck at the cost of pitching their least useful options, or in the case of the Revival Trio, setting up a big play by pitching off something like a Jinzo to bring back right away. This would be an instant 3 of in practically every deck right away, shaping the metagame as we knew it. A balance update would drop 2 days later, but notably this would be for specifically Nightmare's release, limiting Sangan, Mage Power, United We Stand, and Magic Cylinder, not only ignoring the new cards from these starters, but also missing arguably the best new card from the set, Torrential. And those 2 wouldn't be the only relevant non-main set cards added, as Stairway to the Destined Duel released 2 weeks later on April 15th, and as is customary, brought 3 new promos in its wake. The first of these, Valkyrion the Magna Warrior, was completely inconsequential, being simply an anime card, but the other 2 were meta warpers. Sinister Serpent, if in your grave at the standby phase, adds itself back to hand. This had multiple uses between being a repeatable attack blocker and a discard payment that reimbursed itself, but most importantly made Graceful Charity that much more powerful, able to discard itself for half of Charity's payment, then refund itself the next turn. The other would be Harpy's Feather Duster, the Raigeki to Heavy Storm's Dark Hole. I don't think I need to tell you how insanely powerful this was, so let's just jump ahead to the ban list that came within 3 weeks. Sinister Serpent, Duster, and Heavy Storm would all be limited, while Graceful would be semi, being effectively a dedicated list update for these new promo releases, recognizing that 4 of the 5 new cards brought in these waves were bound to be meta breakers. This would be the metagame for about a month until we reached the next core set, and any chance of us getting out of the good stuff piles loop was going to have to rest on its shoulders. Legacy of Darkness. Release date, June 6th, 2003. Set type, core set. Major strategies, spirits, warriors, dragons. Impact, defining more specific deck types. Legacy of Darkness was the 6th core set, and unlike the previous core sets, seemed to be focused on providing a bit more delineation between decks in the metagame by giving certain classifications of monsters their own dedicated support. While this concept was introduced in LOB with the initial equip spells, it's always been lackluster up until this point, with the direction the set gave being some of the first true direction for monster classifications. This time around, there would be 3 specific types of monsters getting dedicated support, being Fiends, Warriors, and Dragons. Fiends would receive some of the least impactful support overall comparatively, with the only standout in this group being Dark Ruler Hades, a 1 tribute 2450 that negates the effects of anything a Fiend destroys in battle and can't be summoned from the grave. Quite notably, this isn't just its on-field floating effects, it's all effects period, as long as that monster is in public knowledge after being destroyed under those conditions. Its effect can't be used, including cards like Sinister Serpent, who can't recur itself back if destroyed that way. Hades was another addition to the 1 tribute pool that was actually worth the consideration, like Jinzo and Summon Skull before him, but notably came with the drawback of not being revivable, meaning that to summon him, you'd have to do it the proper way for now. Also notably, being at 1600 defense meant that unlike the other options, it was not searchable with Witch, being a heavier downside in terms of comparison, but with the number of monster effects it could blank on its own, like Witch or Sangan, many were considering the powerhouse. Warriors absolutely got the better side of the support here, seeing Marauding Captain, who blocks attacking other warriors and summons a warrior from hand on normal, Exiled Force, who contribute itself to pop a monster, Reinforcement of the Army, or Rhoda for short, which searched any level 4 or lower warrior, and the Warrior Returning Alive, which recurs a warrior from grave to hand. Exiled Force and Rhoda would be instant includes for most decks, whether they be warrior or good card piles, though Marauding Captain and Returning Alive would also see some play in more dedicated warrior strategies, specifically for Marauding interactions with himself. If you were able to get out 2 copies of Marauding Captain, you would prevent both of them and all other warriors from being attacked, locking the opponent from attacking you as long as you controlled both of them and no non-warriors. This was also a fairly simple to establish board state thanks to Marauding's board flooding effect and Rhoda's ability to grab the second out of deck, allowing the combo to see significant play. Dragon's big piece here was Spear Dragon, a 1900 attacker that deals piercing damage and swaps the defense after it attacks. While not nearly as restrictive as Attack Force and providing real benefit with the piercing damage, Spear Dragon was still a bit of a niche pick for decks, though the 1900 stat line did bring it a lot of love. Dragons also receive Super Rejuvenation, which draws a card at the end of the turn for each dragon you discarded or tributed that turn. While not particularly great now, as the only real enabler of this was Graceful Charity and Card Destruction, it was notably stackable with other copies of itself, even those drawn with its own effect. So if any options in the future allow you to mass discard dragons, this could prove quite useful. Moving away from type support, spirits would be a new monster subtype, unable to be special summoned and returning to the hand at the end of the turn they're flipped or summoned. Generally, their effects were either considered powerful enough to recur them back, but most of them fell completely flat, as you'd lose the advantage they'd gain on their own from them returning back every turn. There were 2 exceptions in this initial batch, being Azura Priest, able to attack every monster on the field once, making it a useful tool for clearing wide boards, and the true problem child of this set, Yatagarasu. If Yatagarasu deals battle damage, the opponent has to skip their next draw phase, which is effectively a hand rip, similar to others that we've seen in the past like White Magical Hat. And this one is substantially weaker and has to be replayed every turn, so why is it more important? Well, for starters, returning it to hand is actually a positive for this specific card, as it insulates it from some of the more common removal cards like Dark Hole and Raigeki. But moreover, its effect, while functionally the same in terms of card advantage generated, has one specific instance where it's infinitely better. What happens if you attack someone while their hand is empty? And thus, the Yata lock was born. If the opponent didn't have a way to out the Yata available to them the moment the card came down for the first time and it was able to connect to their life points, the game was effectively over. Yata could poke for 200 points of damage every turn until the opponent lost the duel, not taking into account any other monsters in your possession at the time, which made it an incredibly dangerous thorn to keep an eye out for. But thankfully, situations where the Yata lock would land at this stage were few and far between outside of hands where you ripped your opponent apart first. It was still played in most decks though, just to have as an option, as who wouldn't want to play the auto win button. In a similar vein, Fiber Jar, on flip, effectively resets the game, shuffling back all cards from the field, hand, and grave for both players and drawing them 5 new cards, resetting everything but the banished zone and life points. Similarly to how every player would love to have an instant win button, every player would also love to have a panic button when the game's gone so far south that you need a full reset to put things back in your favor, which Fiber Jar provides, making it a meta staple for the foreseeable future. Air Knight Parshath provides piercing on a 1900 attack body for 1 tribute, also drawing a card when it deals battle damage. While easily the weakest of the various 1 tributes to see meta stints so far, Parshath wouldn't be too useful at this exact moment, but did provide a significant counter to decks that get a little too comfortable with Scapegoat specifically. Injection Fairy Lily, for the cost of 2,000 life points, can boost herself to 3,000 attack for 1 combat. This would be another near instant staple alongside the previously mentioned Exiled Force, as both provided reliable monster removal through their effects, with Lily's being more costly but also sticking around after the fact to continue providing pressure. Creature Swap has both players select a monster they control and give it to the opponent, a spell that would prove incredibly useful in a meta of floaters, as when they're destroyed, no matter which side of the field they're on, they trigger in their owner's graveyard, meaning that you could pass a Sangan to the opponent, run it over with their monster, and still receive the search, making Swap a solid inclusion for various decks. Royal Oppression is a continuous trap that can negate any special summon or effect that special summons for 800 life points each, usable by either player. Seemingly, this was a proactive measure in case a deck wanted to go all in on the rarely used special summoning mechanic at this stage, and though it wouldn't see play for now with special summons few and far between, it would see a significant amount of play in later eras of the game. Bottomless Trap Hole is effectively the previous Trap Hole, but with the attack requirement up to 1500, able to hit special summons now, and banishing the target instead of just destroying it. At this moment in time, it was a solid piece, but not worth the heavy investment into it, as Torrential Tribute covered all of its cases and then some in a meta where not every monster is 1500 or more attack. But Bottomless would still be around as an option in the metagame. Drop Off makes the opponent discard the card they just drew for turn. While a simple effect, this was effectively a better version of the previous Time Seal, not needing an awkward amount of time to set up, just being usable from the word go after being set. While not particularly powerful, hand control tools were becoming more and more prevalent, and as such, Drop Off would similarly see play alongside of these options. Last Turn can only be used while you have 1,000 or less life, takes 1 monster you control and sends all other cards on the field and in both players' hands to grave, summons 1 monster from the opponent's deck of their choice, and has those monsters battle, with the winner of that combat being the winner of the duel and any other cases being a draw. This was a massive headache of a card, but for the time wasn't too overbearing, being effectively a last-ditch effort way to close out a game you were losing, and it would not be relevant in the slightest for now, but with more complex cards coming in the near future and a metric ton of corner case issues with this card, this will not be the last time we talk about Last Turn. Overall, this set was an experimentation of sorts, looking at how impactful it would be to support a handful of specific groups of cards, which seemed to be a success, with warriors quickly becoming solid tools in their own deck while the more generic pieces became tools in good stuff piles. As expected though, a few of the cards here were overtuned compared to the meta, and as such, a new limited list would come down a month later, placing limits on Exiled Force, Fiber Jar, Injection Fairy Lily, Twin-Headed Behemoth, Yatagarasu, as well as semi-limits on Marauding Captain, Creature Swap, Rhoda, and Last Turn. You may have noticed a monster in there that we didn't talk about earlier, being Twin-Headed Behemoth, who wasn't limited because of its power, but rather because of its ruling. Twin-Headed Behemoth had an effect to, 1 time only per copy, revive itself when destroyed on field, which is one of the only instances in the game's history of having a once per duel effect that affected only 1 copy of a card. The question though, with Fiber Jar being a factor, is what happens when that card is shuffled back into the deck after using its effect? How will you know which of the 3 copies a player can run use the effect if it's no longer public knowledge? Upper Deck's answer to this was to limit the card, so even if it got shuffled back, you'd know it was the only copy used because it was the only legal copy to use. Thankfully, this was later corrected by giving it an errata to make its effect a hard once per duel in general, but it was still quite the headache in the meantime. This would actually lead us into the next set just 10 days later, seemingly being sped along to help prepare the TCG player base for something massive just around the corner. Pharaonic Guardian. Release date, July 18th, 2003. Set type, core set. Major strategies, hand control, gravekeepers, zombies. Impact, a first step to change the game forever. Pharaonic Guardian was the 7th core set of the TCG, and with it would come an experiment that would solidify a direction for the game that would be followed for decades to come. Archetypes. An archetype is designated by a specific word, phrase, or unifying detail present on a series of cards that allows for support to be given to that subset without relying on a monster's type or attribute. In this case, the series of monsters in question are the Gravekeepers, all of whom share the archetypal name in their monster name and reference that name among their effects. A perfect example is Gravekeeper Spy, who on flip summons another Gravekeeper's monster from deck with 1500 or less attack. This would actually become an extremely powerful option for decks aiming to stall a touch, being a 2000 defense wall able to summon another copy of itself or the also useful Gravekeeper's Guard, with 1900 defense and a flip effect to bounce an opponent's monster to hand if you drew into it instead. Other monsters for this included Curse, Spear Soldier, Vassal, Watcher, Chief, Cannon Holder, and Assailant, all of which had effects to varying levels of usefulness, but also a few of which mentioned a specific field spell to get their effects. Necro Valley is a field spell that, while on field, effectively locks the graveyard from both players, making cards that would involve the graveyards negated, and also boosting all Gravekeepers by 500 attack and defense. It also came with 2 additional support pieces, those being Royal Tribute, which ripped all monsters from both players' hands if Necro Valley is active, and Rite of Spirit, being a revival trap for Gravekeepers that specifically was unaffected by Necro Valley. These cards were a bold step to take for the game as a whole, pouring more powerful than standard support into an exclusive set of cards, though as a deck, Gravekeepers would sadly not convert into meta performance here. Some of their cards would break away from the deck to be powerful pieces in their own rights, like Spy, Guard, and Necro Valley for grave locking, but beyond those, the archetype as a whole would sort of spin its wheels for now. Zombies would be the next monster type to receive dedicated support this wave, bringing cards like Pyramid Turtle, a floater similar to the attribute recruiters, summoning a monster with 2000 or less defense from deck, Spirit Reaper, an indestructible by battle monster that rips a card from the opponent's hand when it deals battle damage, notably being destroyed if it's targeted by a card effect, Dark Dust Spirit, a 1 tribute zombie spirit that nukes all other face-up monsters on normal or flip, and Book of Life, a revival spell for zombies that also banishes a monster from the opponent's grave. All of these were notably powerful, with Spirit Reaper becoming a meta staple in its own right, but the other 3 needing to find the right home with cards in the future. Notably in the case of Pyramid Turtle, its floating condition was extremely lax but lacked a good zombie target worth summoning at this point in time, which given even one good target could change its placement. King Tiger Wonku, anytime a monster with 1400 or less attack is summoned while he's on the field, destroys that monster. This would mostly be a side deck tool for now, being effectively a floodgate against strategies running lower attack monsters, which actually would become more common here momentarily, effectively requiring a non-low attack out to move plays forward, but wouldn't be too popular of a side deck tool due to the prevalence of monsters like Kaiku, who could just attack over it. Don Zalug, upon dealing battle damage, either discards a random card from the opponent or mills 2 from them. This card has a lot of things going for it. 1400 attack made it searchable by Sangan and summonable by Mystic Tomato, Warrior made it searchable by Rhoda, and Hand Rips making it a nearly instant meta piece, tipping the scale on hand control to be easily one of the best decks in the metagame, and this wasn't even the only hand control card in the set. Trap Dust Shoot, if the opponent has 4 or more cards in hand, lets you look at their hand and send a monster in it back to the deck. While not as generically powerful as some of the other hand rip tools, effectively only being good if you're going first, Dust Shoot absolutely contributed towards hand control reaching a critical mass of pieces, as now between Confi, Duo, Sentry, Zalug, Reaper, Yada, Drop Off, Time Seal, and Dust Shoot, hand control's tools had become so numerous that it was bound to take over the metagame, and the Yada lock, something that was a bit far-fetched to have play out the way you would want it to, was becoming more and more likely. Moving away from hand rips, there were 3 monsters that tried to give new takes on flip effects, being Swarm of Scarabs, Swarm of Locust, and Deslakuda. All 3 of these only got their effect on flip summon, with Scarabs popping a monster, Locust popping a spell trap, and Lakuda drawing a card, but they all also had the ability to flip themselves back face down once per turn. While not fully there yet, these cards would be the backbone of a deck in the coming months known as Pac-Man, short for Pure Advantage Camel Munches All Noobs. But as it stood now, the deck was not powerful enough to stand up to beatdown and hand control without more defensive tools in its arsenal. Lava Golem is a 2 tribute monster, but the catch is you tribute summon it to the opponent's board, giving them a 3k attack monster that burns them for 1000 each turn. This was a tech choice card generally, and while right now it wouldn't be popular, as in most cases you wouldn't want to give up the normal to give the opponent something that massive, it would see side deck usage in the coming years as a way to remove the unremovable monsters. Book of Taiyu and Book of Moon were a pseudo pair, with Taiyu being a normal spell that flips a face down monster face up, and Moon being a quick play spell that flips a face up monster face down. Taiyu would see some experimentation alongside all of the various jar monsters we've seen thus far, specifically that of Morphing Jar, to form a deck known as Empty Jar, which aims to repeatedly flip Morphing Jar up and down to empty out the opponent's deck, though this was fairly inconsistent at this stage. The far more impactful card of the two was Book of Moon, as by being a quick play spell, it held far more applications than its sibling. The ability to flip something face down on a quick effect is incredibly powerful, as it can be used to reset flip monsters, stop attacks by flipping the attacker face down, reset applied effects to a monster, the list goes on. As such, though it wasn't massively popular out the gate as some of the other staples from this set, Book of Moon would see a fair amount of meta play moving forward due to its utility compared to some of the other limited options. Mirage of Nightmare, in the opponent's standby phase, lets you draw until you have 4 cards in hand, but in your next standby phase requires you to randomly discard the same number of cards you drew. This was, on paper, an extremely risky card, as you couldn't offset the discard cost as easily as you could with others by utilizing Serpent, but the potential to draw 4 was right there if a way could be found to cheat the requirements. So there's a way to cheat the requirements. Because it's a continuous spell, it must remain on the field to resolve any of its effects, meaning that after the draw up to 4 effect resolves, if it's removed before the next standby phase, you don't need to discard. This was shockingly easy to dodge thanks to Mystical Space Typhoon being a quick play spell, meaning that you could either set it going into the Mirage draw and pop it on the opponent's turn that way, or if you drew it off of Mirage, you could activate it in your draw phase to pop the Mirage before entering the standby phase where you need to discard. As such, because MST was already a staple 3 of in most players' decks, Mirage just became an instant inclusion as well, with the potential of a draw 4 just too enticing to pass on. Reasoning makes the opponent call a number between 1 and 12, then mills cards from the top of your deck until you hit a normal summonable monster, and if it's not the called level, it gets summoned to your field. An absolute powerhouse of a card, able to turbo through your deck to a monster, but the catch of the level call from the opponent makes it a bit of a gamble, as most viable monsters at this stage have been level 4. It wouldn't see much play for now, but was a notable bomb if loading cards into the grave ever became relevant. Terraforming searches any field spell and adds it to hand, which at this stage was only useful for specifically Gravekeepers as a strategy, as all of the other field spells at this stage simply weren't worth it. Metamorphosis, by tributing a monster, summons a fusion monster with the same level from your extra deck. This card was able to convert monsters into power drops, but at this stage, most of the monsters that were worth summoning with it were in the higher level range anyways, making it a bit of a win more card on first examination. That is, it was that way on first examination, as there was specifically one fusion monster in the available pool that didn't fall into that category. Thousand Eyes Restrict was in the pool if you tributed a level 1 monster, meaning that you could convert a card like Scapegoat or Sinister Serpent into a full board locker, though this application wasn't explored heavily at this point in time. As for the traps this go round, only 3 here are worth talking about, and even among those 3, only one of them would be actively meta relevant. Reckless Greed and Raigeki Break would be solid additions to the pool, with Reckless being a draw 2 that skips your next 2 draw phases, but notably could stack that restriction with multiple copies, allowing you to get up to 6 draws and only need to skip 2 draw phases in exchange, and Break being a targeted pop for anything at the cost of a discard, which could be offset with Serpent, but neither of these options would break into meta contention for the time being. The absolute standout trap, and honestly standout card of the set, was Ring of Destruction, which destroyed any monster and dealt its attack as damage to both players. This was an instant staple in the game, as you could use it as a single target removal piece for something the opponent was threatening you with, or you could just use it on your own monster after getting in damage to clean up the game, effectively giving you a double attack with the damage it outputs. And no example could I give better than what took place just a month later. The first ever Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship would be held on August 10th, 2003 in New York City at Madison Square Garden, no less. This tournament was made up of top performing players from the Upper Deck official tournaments, as well as the national champions from regions that supported that level of play at this point. Of the 18 players, 8 had brought hand control, 3 brought beatdown, and 7 we do not know the decks of, but in the top 4 cut, all of the other decks had been weeded out, with hand control being the only deck in the room worth playing. The raw power of keeping your opponent off of options was completely unmatched at this stage, with Donzalug, Yada, Reaper, Confi, Duo, Sentry, Drop Off, and Dust Shoot all seeing usage, with Yangyu Liang taking the title of the first Yu-Gi-Oh! World Champion with this strategy. Also notably included in all 4 topping lists was Fiber Jar, which was effectively one of the only real ways to get back all cards being lost in the hand control game by resetting the card pool back to basics. As such, options that remove Fiber Jar without flipping it were abundant, between Exiled Force, Noblemen of Crossout, and even some players on Sasuke Samurai to remove it without flipping it. The Pharaonic Guardian adjustments to the limited list came down 2 weeks later on August 25th, and notably, even though these adjustments came out after Worlds, Worlds was still played using these, as players in other regions had had these adjustments for a bit now. Newly limited were Graceful Charity, Mirage of Nightmare, Reckless Greed, and Ring of Destruction. Also, the first ever removals from the list would be present here, seeing Limiter removal and Backup Soldier completely taken off the list. Notably, Reckless Greed going to 1 here completely kills any chance the card had at being relevant, as you could no longer stack the downsides to get massive card advantage, but all of the other changes were in line with what we've come to expect at this stage. Beyond these, the only notable happening before the next core set was the release of Tournament Pack 4, which brought with it a new chase card in Royal Decree, being similar to Imperial Order, affecting traps instead of spells, though notably did not have a maintenance cost and therefore could not be switched off at will. This led into the next core set a few months after the limited list updates, and with hand control easily taking over the meta at large, primarily backed up by a powerful performance at Worlds, a shakeup would be sorely needed to break us out of it. Unfortunately, a shakeup it would bring, but not one that many would enjoy. Magician's Force. Release date October 10th, 2003. Set type Core Set. Major strategies, Unions, Spellcasters. Impact, the first FTK Blight on the meta. Magician's Force was the 8th overall core set, and similar to some of the previous sets, it aimed to split up its focus between type support for spellcasters as well as introducing a new subtype in Unions. Unions have the ability to equip themselves from field to a specific monster as an equip card, giving that monster some kind of benefit, generally a stat boost, battle destruction prevention, and or another effect. The poster children for this new mechanic were the XYZ monsters of X-Head Cannon, Y Dragonhead, and Z Metal Tank, being monsters used by Kaiba in the Battle City arc, with Y able to attach to X and Z able to attach to Y or X, both of whom give both battle and effect destruction prevention while equipped. These three also had another gimmick on top of the Union one, being the first ever contact fusion materials. Each of these pairs, as well as all three together, had a fusion that could be made by banishing themselves from field, completely sidestepping the need for polymerization. XY can discard a card to pop a face-up spell trap, YZ can discard to pop a face-down monster, XZ can discard to pop a face-down spell trap, and XYZ can discard to pop any card. While innovative in many respects, the XYZ monsters, as well as Unions as a whole, premiered with a resounding thud, being completely unplayable in a meta sense due to the amount of setup required to actually utilize in any meaningful manner, though they would still be fan favorites due to the anime tie-ins. Spellcasters would be the monster type focus this time around, bringing an interesting roster overall, focused on another new mechanic, those being spell counters. Most of the new spellcasters here had effects that tied to either placing spell counters onto cards on the field or utilizing those spell counters for their own effects, such as skilled Dark and White Magician, who gain counters every time a spell is used and contribute themselves with 3 counters on them to summon either Dark Magician or Buster Blader from hand, deck, or grave. These effects, and most of the effects involving spell counters quite frankly, were too slow to ever truly matter, but thankfully many of these also had other attributes that would be desirable outside of the spell counter effects, such as skilled Dark Magician being a 1700 monster, being by far and away the most powerful no tribute summon the game has had at this stage. In a similar vein, Breaker the Magical Warrior had a base of 1600 attack, but gains a spell counter on summon that boosts himself by 300, being a 1900 attack normal summon. On top of that, you had the option to trade the spell counter for a spell trap pop if desired, giving Breaker some of the most utility of all the monsters in this particular set, being either a high attack beater or a solid attack beater that also removes a spell trap from the board. Apprentice Magician, when summoned, can load a spell counter onto a monster, and when destroyed in battle, sets a level 2 or lower spellcaster from deck. The first effect wasn't relevant outside of edge case scenarios, but the floating effect here was actually extremely useful, able to float into the always popular Magician of Faith, or into the new option of Old Vindictive Magician, who pops a monster on flip, similar to Maneater Bug. Royal Magical Library gains a counter anytime a spell is activated and can trade 3 counters to draw 1. Probably one of the only instances of the spell counter generator monsters being decent for the effect specifically. Library would find a home in effectively every version of Exodia decks for the time being, turning all of your draw spells into 1/3 of another draw, which while not meta viable was still worth noting. Lastly, for spellcasters, Magical Scientist lets the user pay 1000 life points to summon a level 6 or lower fusion from the extra deck, returning it there at the end of the turn. This was a problem. Let's say you managed to get both Scientist and Catapult Turtle onto the board at the same time. Scientists could summon out 7 fusions from the extra deck by paying 7,000 life points, sacking them off one by one for Turtle to burn the opponent for half of their attack, which for the fusions of Punished Eagle, Empress Judge, and Roaring Ocean Snake meant that you were burning for 1050 damage a hit, putting the opponent down to 650 life points by the end of it, at which point you could tribute the Scientist for 150 and the Turtle for 500, making it an even 8,000 damage. While this sounds gimmicky, which it was consistent enough to be a thorn in many players' sides, specifically because of tools like Reasoning, Last Will, and Gillosaurus to get the 2 key monsters on the field as fast as possible. This was just consistent enough to win a fair number of games on its own, but not quite consistent enough to take home tournaments, meaning that for now, it passed under the radar, though an absolute annoyance and a time waster if you got paired into it. Tribe Infecting Virus at the cost of a discard can nuke all cards of a single monster type from the board. This could be as simple as a 1-for-1 removal, or as widespread as a board nuke depending on the type of monster on the board, which even after that, Tribe Infecting having 1600 attack is nothing to scoff at, making it quite a viable option coming into the Magician's Force metagame. There were also a number of burn tools allocated here, between Wave Motion Cannon, Mass Driver, and Secret Barrel, all of which moved the needle on burn decks a little, but the only one worth considering was Wave Motion due to the massive amount of damage it could output when backed up with the right stall tools. A new limited list followed a month later, and as is standard by this point, brought down limits onto Breaker the Magical Warrior and Tribe Infecting Virus, easily the 2 standouts from the set, but beyond that, all was quiet on the metagame. Hand Control continued to be the best deck in the room, still effectively being a good card turbo deck in many respects, and as such, good stuff piles continued to be the norm, as without something substantial to break that mold, it would continue to be the same story. Dark Crisis. Release date, December 1st, 2003. Set type, core set. Major strategies, Guardians, Archfiend. Impact, more good cards to add to the good stuff pile. Dark Crisis sort of embodies the issue with the TCG at this stage. With each set, a small handful of cards would be picked out of it and added to the same good stuff piles we've seen up until this point. And thus far, that handful has been getting smaller and smaller by the set. Honestly speaking, Dark Crisis as a whole was bound to be a bit of a flop, as the cards that they were printing here were actually cards used by various villains and filler arcs of the anime, such as Exodia Necros and Shinado from the Virtual World arc, and the Guardians from the Waking the Dragons arc. As such, let's just blitz through the 7 cards actually worth talking about here. Vampire Lord is a 1 tribute boss that when it deals battle damage makes the opponent send a card of their choice from deck to graveyard of a super type you choose, being monsters, spells, or traps, and if destroyed by card effect revives in your next standby phase. This was the first truly viable boss for zombies, and because its defense value was under 2000, it was actually summonable by Pyramid Turtle. Being also effectively immune to card effect destruction made Lord a popular option, as it effectively required another high power boss just to be able to out it, letting it see some meta viability off of these factors. DD Warrior Lady, after battling a monster, has the option to banish both herself and the monster she battled. Warrior Lady was an instant staple, effectively being a better version of the previous DD Warrior, also searchable with Rhoda and able to remove any and everything she battled while having that effect be a choice, not a requirement, making her an instant meta staple. Butterfly Dagger Elma boosts a monster by 300 and when destroyed goes back to hand. This would actually be a piece that formed another OTK line, specifically using Royal Magic Library and Gearfried. By having both on the board and equipping Elma to Gearfried, it would be destroyed, a counter would go onto Library, and Elma would return to hand. This was repeatable any number of times, allowing you to get infinite draws from your deck, enabling an Exodia draw-out kill. This was only one of the OTK lines available through Gearfried and Elma's combination, which while not consistent enough to matter right now, as you need to find both somehow, it would still be a pain having yet another OTK deck in the format alongside Magical Scientist. Tsukiyomi is a spirit that on summon or flip, flips a monster face down. While not particularly powerful at this point in time, Tsukiyomi did prove to be an interesting tool in repeating certain flip effects, removing monsters with low defense, or even in blanking certain effects. Sakuretsu armor was effectively a mini Mirror Force, able to destroy an attacking monster, but because it was effectively Mirror Force light, only saw a little play at this point in time. Skill Drain removes all effects of monsters on the field at the cost of 1000 life on activation, which at this stage was not really worth it, as the effects on field were either not good enough to be negated, or remove themselves on field in use, making them unaffected, but this would be another card that would see usage later on. This would actually be the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2003, as the limited list update for Dark Crisis wouldn't come out until February 2nd of 2004, limiting Magical Scientist, Reflect Bounder, Vampire Lord, and Butterfly Dagger Elma, with Morphing Jar moving down the list from limited to semi-limited. Overall, Dark Crisis sort of did nothing to the tournament scene as a whole, which was rather disappointing at this stage, as the meta over the last year had truly stagnated, with no real shifts in meta placement. However, a shift was coming, as the first set of 2004 was right around the corner, and this wouldn't just be a shift to the metagame, it was about to change Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole forever. Invasion of Chaos. Release date March 1st, 2004. Set type Core Set. Major strategies Chaos, Banishment. Impact the first true overhaul to the game. Invasion of Chaos is widely considered to be the first true turning point in terms of the power level of the game, where most matchups up until this point consisted of normal summon, maybe a special summon, combat, and then passing turn. IOC would be the first true break from that mentality in the form of the Chaos bosses. These cards all had the same summon condition, an inherent special summon by banishing a light and dark monster from the graveyard, and as such represented some of the largest swings in power a card could bring at this time. Both Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning and Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End matched the stats of Blue Eyes White Dragon, which at this point was the most powerfully statted monster in the game, and both were summonable far easier than Blue Eyes ever was. BLS could either banish a monster by giving up its attack for the turn, or can attack a second time that turn when it destroys a monster in battle. CED could, by paying 1,000 life points, nuke both players' fields and hands and inflict 300 damage to the opponent for each card hit this way. Both of these monsters were by far and away game-endingly powerful compared to what had come before just on their own, with BLS being a board advantage swinger like we've never seen before, and CED effectively reducing the remaining game down to a top deck war, or so you'd think on the surface. If you had managed to stick a Witch of the Black Forest or Sangan the previous turn that was still on the field, when you drop CED and nuke the board, they'll be able to search for Yatagarasu, who can then be summoned, deal its direct damage, and lock the opponent out of the rest of the game, as they'll have no cards left to use. This version of the Yata lock became one of the most common game locking plays in the meta, taking the previous Yata lock to its absolute extreme. But even without it, the Chaos bosses on their own were so game warpingly powerful that most players would start opting to include a number of less optimal light attributed monsters to fill those slots for the Chaos summon condition. In addition to the two Envoy bosses, there was also Chaos Sorcerer, who was effectively a weaker BLS, only having the banish side of his effect and only for face-up monsters, but would be considered an option in the near future for pretty obvious reasons. Death Kangaroo, if attacked while in defense, destroys the attacking monster if its attack is lower than Kangaroo's defense. Effectively a stronger Maneater bug for anything under 1700, as well as being a dark for a Chaos typing, Death Kangaroo would see some tech play as an option to out certain offensive monsters that were growing in popularity with the rise of the Chaos typing. Strike Ninja, by banishing two darks and grave, could banish itself until the end phase on a quick effect. This effect was useful for two reasons. One, it allowed Strike Ninja to dodge certain forms of removal by tagging itself out for the turn. And two, it set up combos with another spell introduced in this set, Dimension Fusion, able to pay 2,000 life points to have both players summon back as many banished monsters as possible. The power of this one spell was, notably, insane. Because of the nature of Chaos, you would almost always have at least two banished monsters once your endgame push began, and as such, always had options to bring back with Dimension Fusion, that could range from resource generators like Sangan and Witch to massive boss drops like Dark Magician of Chaos, who on summon recovers any spell from your grave, banishes any monster it destroys in battle, and when removed from the field, banishes itself instead. Demok was a good bit different from the other Chaos monsters we've discussed up until this point, namely in that there's no way to inherently special summon it like the others, but arguably its effect is just as explosive in the right scenario. Because of Dimension Fusion, you could effectively form a loop between these two cards, using Demok to recycle back Fusion and Fusion to resummon Demok, who then recycles back the Fusion and starts the loop over again. This wasn't the only use of Demok though, as its effect could grab any spell in grave, meaning that power spells like Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, Change of Heart, and the board wipes Raigeki and Dark Hole could be recycled back too. DD Scout Plane, during the end phase of the turn it's banished, can summon itself back to the field in attack position. A solid recursive body for the Chaos decks, but wouldn't see play for now due to being too slow and weak for the recursion to matter, but would see play later on with the improvement of a general banishment toolbox. Berserk Gorilla is a 2k level 4 that is destroyed if in defense position and must attack if able. Gorilla is one of the most prominent beatdown tools of the DM era, namely because of its all-in playstyle, which caters nicely towards the game plan of beatdown itself. You rarely care that you had to attack with it, as you standardly wanted to, and as such, Gorilla became a popular budget budget option in the upcoming format. Freed the Brave Warrior, by banishing 2 lights in Grave, can pop a monster with more attack than itself. While this effect was used on occasion, Freed's main purpose in the meta was being a higher attack light body warrior for usage in Chaos engines, which you would see played generally as a one-off for. Gridmaju Daiza's attack and defense are always equal to the number of your banished cards times 400. While not popular for now, as the only reliable way of banishing your own cards were the aforementioned Chaos bosses, Aiza would become a popular budget option in the coming months for other reasons. Manticore of Darkness, during the end phase of the turn it's sent to grave, can send a Beast, Beast Warrior, or Winged Beast from hand or field to grave to revive itself. While this seems lackluster, a funny loop was actually found by utilizing 2 copies of itself and the card of Safe Return. By getting it into the grave while controlling Safe Return and having the other copy in hand, you could pitch the one in hand to revive the one in grave, drawing a card from Safe Return, then triggering the one pitched from hand, swapping the 2 back and forth repeatedly until you drew into Exodia. That's right, it's another Exodia FTK enabler. This wouldn't be as popular of an option for FTK players as the Dagger Gearfried loop or the Magical Scientist line, but would still be an option in the current space as cheese decks became a good bit more viable of an option. Ryu Koki, at the end of the damage step it battles a warrior or spellcaster, destroys that monster. While this effect is decent overall, that would not be the reason it saw play. With its stats being 2400-2000, this was now the strongest zombie monster summonable with Pyramid Turtle, giving zombie decks an actually viable powerful boss to cheat out of the turtle whose attack went over 2000. Invader of Darkness, while on the field, locks the opponent from using quick play spells. This is actually not a bad floodgate at the time due to the prevalence of cards like MST, Book of Moon, and the occasionally cited Offerings to the Doomed. So while not the most practical boss, it did hold a niche, though was considerably disliked due to being the second secret rare in a set where the first and only other secret rare was a meta-warping powerhouse. Smashing Ground operated like a flipped version of Fissure, destroying the opponent's monster with the highest defense. This was unquestionably a better version of Fissure, and as such would see some play, though not as widespread as you might expect. Compulsory Evacuation Device bounces a monster on field to hand. While a simple effect, in many respects it was a multifaceted card, able to stop attacks, reset effects, or even interrupt combos, and as such would be considered an option for the trap lineup. Lastly, Self-Destruct Button, if your life points are at least 7,000 lower than your opponent's, ends the game in a tie by putting both players' life points to 0. This card would become an extremely problematic one in the future due to tournament procedures once a proper tier 1 circuit is established, but for now would simply just be seen as pack filler garbage. Now thankfully, the Chaos bosses wouldn't be left to terrorize the game as a whole for long completely unimpeded, as a limited update would come a little over a month later on April 19th, limiting both envoys and semi-limiting Manticore of Darkness due to its FTK loops. Though these were limited, the meta itself had become a bit of a cesspool in a lot of respects. Because the power of these bosses was so astronomically higher than any other deck you could be playing at the time, and the fact that they slotted nearly perfectly into the already tier 1 hand control strategy, Chaos Control became a tier 0 mega threat like the game had never seen before. This strategy was so fast with its resource game and so reliable in its power level that it left almost every player with only 2 options. Play Chaos so you can keep up, or play an FTK that doesn't let Chaos play the game. With that in mind, Manticore Exodia, Magical Scientist, and to a lesser extent Gearfried Exodia, would all rise in popularity during this period, being some of the only strategies that could do anything before either the Chaos bosses ended the game, or your hand was completely destroyed thanks to the other already present hand rippers. A little detour from the doom and gloom, however, the Yu-Gi-Oh anime had quickly become one of the most popular on the channel it was ran on in the US, Kids WB. As such, Kids WB during this period ran a sweepstakes to receive a copy of an exclusive card at the time, Card of Sanctity, of which only 108 copies were made with this set code to be given out with this sweepstakes, with 100 being mailed out and the remaining 8 being given as prizing for the Duel of Destiny tournament, which sadly we have lost all information about. This is to this day considered one of the rarest cards on the market for collectors, specifically for the set code EP1EN000, which was exclusive to this printing, and as such, in many respects, is one of the rarest cards that can be found currently for the TCG side of the game. As we descend back into the meta of the time, we turn to the next core set just around the corner. As with the chaos-ruled meta landscape, this was the only chance for the next 3 months to give anything the ability to compete. Ancient Sanctuary. Release date, June 1st, 2004. Set type, core set. Major strategies, the agents, Monarch. Impact, nothing to dethrone chaos. Ancient Sanctuary is a bit of a weird set to look back on, as in the short term, nothing changed from this set's release. However, with hindsight, this set actually brought a couple of impactful cards for the long term of the game, though some of these cards wouldn't be heavily experimented with until later once the tier 0 in the room died down. The agents were the archetype pushed by the set, with the titular Ancient Sanctuary being the Sanctuary in the Sky, a field spell that blocked battle damage to a player who battles with a fairy monster. As such, the agents, all being based on the planets of the solar system, had a wide range of effects, such as Mars gaining attack and defense equal to how many life points you had over your opponent while Sanctuary was up, and Saturn able to tribute itself to burn the opponent for the difference in your life points while yours were higher if Sanctuary was active. Yeah, these weren't very good. Among the agents, the only one worth considering was Venus, who could pay 500 to summon a mystical shine ball from hand or deck any number of times in a turn, which held extremely niche usage, and as such, agents were forgotten just as fast as they were introduced. Legendary Jujutsu Master stacks any monster that battles with it while it's in defense back on top of its owner's deck, in a lot of ways similar to Death's Kangaroo from the last set, but able to affect any card this time. This would see some tech play, but sort of middling due to being an Earth and not part of the Chaos typing pool. Zaborg the Thunder Monarch, on Tribute Summon, destroyed a monster on the field. This would be the first in a new series of monsters that would be drip fed to us over the coming sets known as the Monarchs, a series of Tribute Summon bosses with some form of disruption or removal effect that triggers on a successful Tribute Summon. While Zaborg wouldn't be too useful now, it was still a solid lead into the monster line, and its successors would range from a little worse to a whole lot better as we moved along. Night Assailant, on flip, destroys a monster, and on being sent from hand to grave returns another flip monster from grave to hand. This would actually be a shockingly useful card not for the Man-Eater bug effect, but for the discard effect. With 2 copies, by discarding one you could recur back the other, and because this was instantaneous unlike the similar Sinister Serpent, this could be used to help counteract the numerous number of hand rip decks running around the meta. As such, Night Assailant would actually become a staple piece moving forward, being played in a similar vein to Sinister Serpent. Enemy Controller as a quick play could either change the battle position of a face-up monster, or tribute one of your monsters to take control of another face-up monster for the turn. At this point in time, this would see 0 play, as an arguably better card, Book of Moon, did a similar effect, and was still mostly relegated to side deck play, though its day would come in the following era. Monster Gate, for the cost of a tribute, was effectively reasoning without giving the opponent an opportunity to call the level. This in turn made it and reasoning work well together, effectively forming a combo between the cards to help certain decks turbo through and find specific monsters and load up the grave with spells, which for decks specializing in DMOC proved to be an incredibly powerful effect, which we'll discuss later. Level Limit Area B, while on the field, changes all level 4 and highers to defense. A similar stun styled card to Gravity Bind before it, Area B would see play in a similar vein, namely in stun focused strategies. Lastly, Wall of Revealing Light, by paying life points on activation in increments of 1000, blocks all monsters with an attack lower than that amount paid from attacking while on the field. While you'd think this would just be another stun tool, this would actually be a catalyst for a variety of extremely frustrating decks centered around the card's last turn and self-destruct button, allowing you to pay down to the threshold to activate those traps without having to play out games at all. While there were cards worth discussing from Sanctuary, most of them were not relevant in the immediate future, especially because this card pool had no effect on Worlds for the year. The 2004 Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship was held in Los Angeles, California on July 25th, and unsurprisingly, Chaos would show an incredibly brutal metagame stranglehold. Togawa Masatoshi of Japan would take this year's title using the deck, notably playing an extremely light light count, with only Shining Angel and Magician of Faith being lights that would stick around in the grave, as DD Warrior Lady would banish herself regularly. Notably, Magical Scientist would be a common tech sighting for the strategy, aiming to burn its effect to get together fusions that could either be used to sweep the field of threats with Thousand Eyes, provide protection with Dark Balter and Ryu Senshi, or simply provide chaos materials to trigger something like a Torrential and get bodies in the grave for summoning an Envoy. The only non-chaos deck to crack into the top 8 here would be Beatdown, which effectively aimed to be aggressive far earlier with cards like Berserk Gorilla, Kaiku, and Bazoo, all able to either push significant damage or help keep chaos off their push pieces. Directly following the World Championships, a couple of new releases would be used to help promote the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie, which was beginning its theatrical run around this time, those being the exclusive pack, a pack of guaranteed pulls, all being cards used in the movie, as well as the movie pack promos, which contained one of 4 cards from the movie, such as Blue Eye Shining Dragon and Wadapon. Of these cards, most of them were not even remotely good, but one from the exclusive pack would be immediately recognized as game-warpingly powerful. Returned from the different dimension, at the cost of half of your life points, could return as many banished monsters as possible from your banishment to the field. being effectively a one-sided dimension fusion. This was unbelievably powerful, and recognizably so, as Chaos had once again been given a bomb to drop on the format, this time without the risk of the opponent bringing back their own tools. Though for Chaos, this new tool would be overshadowed by a historic event for the early years of the game. On August 25th, 2004, an announcement would be posted to Upper Deck's website, giving effectively a 1-month warning for what was about to be the game's first ever ban list, moving cards from the limited section, where 1 copy each was allowed, to a newly designated forbidden section, where any cards within cannot be played at official events. The cards included with this initial warning were Chaos Emperor Dragon, Sangan, Witch, Yada, Darkhole, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, Harpy's Feather Duster, Monster Reborn, Raigeki, United We Stand, Imperial Order, and Mirror Force. This was a massive culling wave to a series of staples that had been in the meta since their inception, as well as to the main problem cards of the current Tier 0 Menace, which the player base welcomed with open arms. There was another release in this time span, being the 2004 Collectible Tins, bringing new tools to the game, with only Blade Knight surviving after the experimentation phase, being another tool for Chaos. But on October 1st, 2004, the bans took effect, in addition to the limiting of Demok, Protector of the Sanctuary, I don't know, MST, Torrential, and Morphing Jar. These limits were mainly to keep a couple of the more degenerate strategies like Dimension Fusion OTK and Empty Jar from taking over the ensuing power vacuum, though notably one deck got missed here. With that in mind, the next core set would also release the same day, but something was different about that one, as it seems change was truly in the air. Soul of the Duelist. Release date, October 1st, 2004. Set type, core set. Major strategies, level, monarch. Impact, is it just me, or did the size of a core set just get cut in half? Soul of the Duelist would be the first time in the history of the TCG at this stage that we'd be officially caught up with the OCG. Now, while the OCG was still receiving sets roughly 5 months before the TCG was, up until this point the TCG was playing catch up by effectively rolling 2 OCG sets worth of cards into a single core set release, such as the sets The Sanctuary in the Sky and Pharaoh's Inheritance from the OCG being rolled together into Ancient Sanctuary in the TCG. From now on, the TCG would be receiving the same sets almost 1-to-1 that the OCG was receiving, even if slightly delayed. Because of this, the number of cards in the set dropped from around 110 to 120 all the way down to 60, which meant that the cards we did receive would have to pull double duty in their power if they wanted to truly reshape the meta around them. The set's focus would be placed on the new level mechanic, with many monsters in the set holding multiple forms, with the lower level ones having weaker effects and a condition to level up into their higher forms. A prime example of this was Horus the Black Flame Dragon. Its level 4 form can't have its control switched, but if it destroyed something in battle, in the end phase, it can send itself to grave to summon the level 6 form from deck, who's completely unaffected by spell cards and has the same condition to level up into the level 8, who can't be normal summoner set, must be summoned by the level 6's effect, and can negate any spell it wants to while on the field. Clearly these level monsters were insanely powerful, and as such many of them would see experimentation right away, although it quickly became clear that some were created more powerfully earlier than others. And as such, no one really wanted to go through the whole process to level up, leaving the mechanic itself on the cutting room floor. There were a couple of these though that were independently powerful, such as Dark Mimic level 1, who draws a card on flip, or Mystic Swordsman level 2, who destroys face downs and attacks without flipping them. But generally, these were seen as tech choices on their own merits instead of being included alongside the rest of their level line. Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke destroys any face-up defense it attacks into. While not nearly as powerful of an effect as Mystic Swordsman level 2, it did have a much stronger body at 1800, allowing it to see play for that as well as being light. Mobius the Frost Monarch, on Tribute Summon, pops up the 2 spell traps on the field. A much stronger version of the Monarchs than Zaborg before it, Mobius put down significant pressure on Tribute Summon thanks to instantly removing 2 possible threats at once prior to combat, allowing it to see instant play. Mind Crush allows you to call a card's name, and if it's in the opponent's hand, it gets sent to the grave, otherwise you discard a random card. This would be useful for sniping out searched cards or big pieces that you know are in hand, and as such would mostly see play as a side deck card for now. And that's it. Soul of the Duelist being only 60 cards meant that there was a lot less to go off of in terms of meta impacts, meaning that for the time being, nothing really changed meta-wise. There were a couple of new additions worth talking about besides Soul, such as Dark Beginning 1, the first ever reprint set, which also brought Makira the Destructor, who when sent to grave allows traps to be activated from hand that turn, being a massive FDK enabler by turning traps into instant combo pieces. The Destiny Board Traveler promos, bringing DD Assailant, being effectively a more situational version of DD Warrior Lady, who was already one of the best monsters in the meta, and the introduction of Shonen Jump promo premieres and Archfiend of Gilfer. While some cards were released as promos within Shonen Jump before, they were usually just allocated to reprints of popular iconic cards like Blue Eyes. But this release would set the standard that Shonen Jump could be used to introduce entirely new cards to the masses. This all led into the final core set of 2004, and alongside it would be a change that had been desperately needed for a long time at this stage. Rise of Destiny. Release date December 1st, 2004. Set type Core Set. Major strategies: the creator, Monarch. Impact: new directions for strategies to take. Rise of Destiny was the second in this new block of core sets following Soul, and as such tried to land its own new direction for cards to take. The creator cannot be summoned from grave and can once per turn be a monster reborn at the cost of a discard on effect resolution. This may not have been relevant in the meta, but was still a significantly fun card to experiment with. Much more relevant was Thestalos the Firestorm Monarch, able to rip a card from the opponent's hand on tribute summon and burn them for that card's level times 100. While not as universal as Mobius was, Thestalos was still a fairly useful monarch, seeing play for the hand rip effect. Dekoichi the Battle-Chanted Locomotive had effectively the same effect as Dark Mimic level 1, just on a better body, and as such usurped the Mimic in most meta strategies. And that really was it for now. I sort of hate that core sets really do just bubble down to a small handful of cards at this stage, and trust me, that's going to get worse. But part of that problem was also that the meta had stagnated down to an issue that many refer to as the cookie cutter problem. Most decks right now had boiled themselves down to effectively a 30 card good stuff pile with 10 cards that delineated the deck type from each other, being seen as a lot of cookie cutter style deck designs for the era. And there was no clearer case for this than the first ever in a new series of tournaments known as the Shonen Jump Championship Series, or SJC for short, starting out with SJC Anaheim on December 4th, 2004. This would be the first time that a major tournament series like this was officially held and supported thanks to Upper Deck. And as such, we finally get to see a clearer picture of the meta at hand, with a new deck, Goat Control, seemingly bubbling up to the top of the meta. The primary discovery made with this was the power of Scapegoat, which was already a tech choice as a combat blocker, in addition with Metamorphosis, who could turn any of the level 1 tokens into Thousand Eyes Restrict, effectively turning the match into a slow crawl until it was either outed or the user was ready to go for the kill. With the rise in popularity of Scapegoat, Air Knight Parshath would bubble back up to the surface and be utilized in various decks, including the first ever SJC winner, John Umali's winning Goat Control list. Not only taking the first SJC, but also winning the first ever SJC prize card, a new monster by the name of Cyberstein, who could pay 5,000 life points to summon any fusion monster from the fusion deck, which while notably powerful was held back by the cost and payoff not being worth the 5k investment. Past the goats, we'd also see decks like Earthbeat, which aim to capitalize on the popularity of Scapegoat with Enraged Battle-Ox, which turns all of your beasts and beast warriors into piercers to push damage with. Chaos Control was very much still a threat too, with access to BLS being a massive blowout tool played in nearly everything. The only deck that didn't have the issue of the cookie cutter dilemma was that of Scientist FTK, but that was due to the much bigger issue of Reasoning Gate. By cycling through copies of Reasoning in Monster Gate, it was a simple process to tear through your deck and find Demok, who could then recycle back copies of Last Will to access the combo and win the game, which was sadly reliable at this stage. And this would leave us at the end of 2004, with the cookie cutter decks being on the rise, a new year about to start with a freshly minted tournament circuit established, and a new anime for Yu-Gi-Oh! And as such, a whole new direction just around the corner to help players get their game on. I'd like to issue a huge thank you to all of you. I understand that I have been gone for quite some time, but I am back and I plan on making more regular content again. In addition to that, I would like to issue a massive thank you to all of my patrons who have stuck around with me through this year. Most of all, Prinrin, Otaku GamerX, Jukes, Kirky666, Arrow Noir, The Critic of Innocence, Franz Burkhauser, and Moses. You all are incredible, and I thank you dearly for sticking with me through this year. Thank you all again, and I will see you very soon.